Is it in full screen now, Ashley?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Okay, so this is passage practice session on July 25th. These were the 2 homework passages assigned, but I guess we can just like read through it. Like I'll just read it and then go over the questions. So the first is the chem physics passage. This is a physics passage dealing with microbubbles and ultrasound. So passage 1 says, microbubbles assisted ultrasound has shown promise in improving local drug delivery. Microbubbles have a diameter of 1 to 7 micrometers and can be filled with inert gases such as SF6 and neon for the purpose of targeted cancer therapy. Sonoporation, a process that involves microbubbles interacting with ultrasound, can be used for drug delivery. In sonoporation, low intensity ultrasound at 0.7 megahertz is commonly used to induce cavitation of microbubbles, which leads to the formation of transient membrane pores that are approximately 15 micrometers in diameter, as well as enhanced endocytosis to increase drug uptake by the target cells and tissues. Based on this rationale, it was investigated whether ultrasound microbubbles triggers exocytosis, resulting in the release of extracellular vesicles. A 1.5 megahertz sinusoidal signal was used to generate 9 of 12 pulsed waveforms, 1 kilohertz pulse repetition frequency, and 100 microsecond pulse duration. The wave was amplified and sent to a piezoelectric transducer with a diameter of 20 millimeters. The transducer was placed on the bottom of a water tank, 8 centimeters below a cell culture chamber frame. The water surface was another 12 centimeters above the frame and heated to 37 degrees. When exposing cells to the ultrasound, the cell culture chamber was mounted in the frame and moved over the US beam. The description of figure 1 is that quantification of EV, which is extracellular vesicles, detected using in conditioned media collected at 4 hours from cells after microbubbles assisted ultrasound or microbubbles treatments, and from untreated cells. Statistical analysis was performed using one-way ANOVA followed by Tukey's test. P-value less than 0.05 is considered significant, indicated by the presence of an asterisk. So moving on to the questions, which of the following properties of ultrasound remains unchanged passing into human tissue? So essentially what this question is asking is what does a change in, what property of sound is not affected by a change in medium? So the answer is frequency. Frequency of sound depends on the source, so it doesn't change between different types of media, so it wouldn't change going from the air into the human tissues, whereas wavelength and wave speed do depend on the medium. And then amplitude is related to energy, and energy also changes between different media because how much of the wave energy is transmitted from one medium to another depends on the degree of difference between the medium, the original medium and the new medium. So basically the takeaway is that frequency is the one property of sound that doesn't change or is not affected by the type of medium that the sound is traveling in. The next question, what is the cumulative power exposed to the cells during the experiment? Let's skip to the answer explanation. So the question is asking about power, and it gives you Planck's constant. So you have to think about, is there an equation that relates power to Planck's constant? So there is no direct equation that does that, but power is related to energy. So you have to use the equation linking energy, Planck's constant, and frequency, because that's the third relevant variable in this passage. So from the passage, you get that your frequency is 1.5 microhertz. So that's this part. And then the Planck's constant was given. So you use this to get the energy, and then you relate the energy to power down here. So it's a two-step, two-equation problem. So once you have energy equals 6.62 times 10 to the negative 34th times 1.5 microhertz, you actually need to convert, megahertz is what this is, megahertz into hertz. So the mega prefix is 10 to the 6th hertz, and a hertz is 1/second. So that's the way to rewrite hertz in terms of base unit. So I would write 1.5 megahertz as 1.5 10 to the 6th hertz, and then also rewrite hertz as 1/seconds. And once you do that, you can multiply out. So what I did here was I took 10 to the negative 34th times 10 to the 6th and did my exponents first to get 10 to the negative 8th, because you just add the exponents when you're multiplying the two terms in scientific notation, and then I multiplied my numbers out front together. So 6 times 1.5 is me approximating 6.62 as just 6. So you get 9 times 10 to the negative 28th. And then these are the units that you end up with, which you should be able to recognize as being joules, or you know that energy should be in terms of joules anyway. So one important thing is to know things like Newton's joules, which are called derived units, what they are like in base units. So then once you have the energy, our original question was asking about power. So power equals energy over time. So you figured out energy was 9 times 10 to the negative 28. And then from the passage, you were told that there are 9 pulses that are 100 microseconds each. So you do 9 times 100 microseconds to get the total amount of time. And then again, because we have time in microseconds, we need to convert. So 1 second equals 10 to the 6th microsecond. So I would rewrite my 900 microseconds as 900 times 10 to the negative 6 seconds. And then to simplify that further, I would rewrite that so that my number out front is between 1 and 10. So that's 9 times 10 to the negative 4th. So again, multiply your exponents first. So you just multiply your exponential term first. So you just add the exponents to get, this is a division problem. So it's energy divided by time. So because you're dividing, you subtract the exponent. So it would be negative 28 minus 4. So it becomes negative 28 plus 4. So this becomes negative 24. And then you just divide this 9 by this 9 to get 1. And one last note is that power units is in watts. So you also have to know things like a watt is joule per second. And you could just figure that out from the power equation. So that's how you get that the answer is 1.1. We got 1.0, but it's pretty similar. So you pick the answer that's closest to that. So it's 1.1 times 10 to the negative 24. And the next question, the speed of sound was 1,540 meters per second. What is the wavelength of the sound used in this study? So we need an equation. Let me skip ahead to the explanation again. We need an equation relating speed, wavelength, and frequency, because in the passage we're given the frequency. This is the same frequency that we used in the last problem. So we use our equation, velocity of sound equals frequency times wavelength, and then rearrange to isolate the variable that you're looking for, which is wavelength. So wavelength equals velocity over frequency. So our velocity is 1,540 meters per second, and then we have frequency in terms of 1.5 microhertz. So this is the same conversion we did in the last problem. Or sorry, I keep saying microhertz. This is megahertz. So 1 megahertz is 10 to the 6th hertz, and then a hertz is 1 over second. So I'm going to rewrite it like that to get 1.5 times 10 to the negative 10 to the 6th hertz, which is the same thing as 1.5 times 10 to the 6th, 1 over seconds. So my seconds cancel out to get just meters. And so then I did 1,500. So I basically approximated 1,540 as 1,500. So 1,500 divided by 1.5 will give you 1,000 in the numerator. And then I just kept my 10 to the 6th down here. So that would get me 1,000 divided by 10 to the 6th is the same thing as 10 to the 3rd divided by 10 to the 6th is 10 to the negative 3 meters. So I did this math in a way that was making sense to me, but you can do it in any way that makes sense to you. So you can just at this point do 1,000 times 10 to the negative 6th and just bring this up here at this stage, and then you would end up with 1,000 times 10 to the negative 6th and rearrange it that way. So there's multiple ways to work out the math in this problem. The goal is just to do it in a way that's intuitive to you and is the quickest for you. So anyway, ending up with a wavelength equals 10 to the negative 3rd meter. You have to rewrite that because our answer choices are in terms of nanometers. So 1 meter is equal to 10 to the 9th nanometer. So I just take my original value and use the conversion factor to get 10 to the 6th nanometer, which is the same thing as 1.0 times 10 to the 6th nanometer. Okay, and then this is asking about which temperature corresponds to the temperature the samples were heated in the study. So the temperature that we were given in the passage is 37 degrees Celsius. So they're just asking you to convert from Celsius to Kelvin. So if you do 37 plus 130, so the formula is just Kelvin equals degrees Celsius plus 273, you get 310. Simple one here. And then the fifth question and the last question, the largest microbubbles with an area of 38.5 micrometers squared have been shown under ultrasound influence to create holes in cell membranes. Average thickness of a membrane is 4 nanometers to assist drug delivery. Over the space of 3 seconds, what would be the flow rate caused by microbubbles of a drug into a cell? So you're looking for flow rate given areas, and then you're given thickness, which you can think about as distance, and then you're given time. So the equation that you're looking for is the flow rate equation, which is Q equals area times velocity is our most familiar form. But because we're given thickness, which is like our distance, and then our time, you have to just rewrite velocity as distance over time. So then we plug in our values, 38.5 micrometers squared times 4 nanometers over 3 seconds. So at this point, we need to convert our units so everything matches. So 1 nanometer equals 0.001 micrometer because 1 nanometer is 10 to the negative 9th meter, and then 1 micrometer is 10 to the negative 6th meter. So the nanometer is a smaller unit. So 1 nanometer would make up an amount. 1 nanometer is 1,000th of a micrometer. So I then rewrite your nanometer in terms of your micrometer distance. So you would just take 4 and divide it by 1,000 to get 0.004. And then multiply everything out. So what I did here was rewrite 38.5 as an approximate of 39 so that I can divide 39 divided by 3. And then once I do that, I get 13, and then I do 13 times 4. So I know 13 times 2 is 26. So if I do 26 times 2, again, that would be 52. So that's another way of doing 13 times 4 in a broken down way, but again, do the math in a way that's easiest for you. So you get approximately 0.05. So I do 13 times 4 to get 52, and then I have to move the decimal point over 3 places. So once I'm at 52, I go 1, 2, 3 to get 0.5 micrometers cubed per second. And that was the last question for that passage.
So in summary, the passage was talking about a protein called TRAP1 and its involvement in ovarian cancer, as well as its mechanism. So a very short passage, a lot of data. Let's dive into the questions. For this question, the correct answer is A. In the passage, we're told that TRAP1 is situated inside the mitochondria and is involved in multiple membrane interactions. Chaperones are proteins that guide other proteins in their folding. They normally prevent incorrect folding, so we can conclude that since TRAP1 forms a complex with cyclophilin D, that it is a chaperone. Option B is wrong. Channel proteins normally don't assist with protein interactions. The fact that TRAP1 binds to cyclophilin D to form a complex should steer you away from this option. Choice C is also incorrect. Microfilaments are made of actin filaments to make up the cytoskeleton. Microfilaments normally are not involved in interaction since their main function is to provide structural support. And finally, option D is incorrect. We don't really have evidence that TRAP1 acts as an ATPase. Now, we are told that the addition of ATPase antagonists causes the collapse of the mitochondrial membrane, but the description of a mitochondrial chaperone best fits the function of TRAP1 because TRAP1, as we said, is involved in multiple membrane interactions. So ATPases are not normally involved in protein interactions and don't form complexes with other proteins. Question 2, based on the passage, which statement accurately describes the action of cyclophilin D? So pause if you need to. The correct answer is D. We're told that TRAP1's function is to prevent apoptosis by inhibiting cyclophilin D. So essentially, cyclophilin D brings about apoptosis. This complex is disrupted when HSP90 interacts with it. So HSP90 reverses TRAP1's inhibition and lets cyclophilin D do its thing by resuming apoptosis. So how exactly does cyclophilin D cause apoptosis? We're also told that it's somewhere in the membrane. If cyclophilin D causes a permanent opening of channel proteins in the mitochondria, then the protons in the intermembrane space cannot go through ATP synthase since they would float to the extracellular medium instead. Similarly, molecules from outside the mitochondria would float into the mitochondria, and that would eventually cause apoptosis. So option D is our answer because the membrane is being collapsed due to the change in ion gradient. Option A is wrong because increasing the number of hydrogen ions in the inner membrane would only cause more ATP to be made. It wouldn't bring about apoptosis. Decreasing the number of protons in the inner membrane space would cause apoptosis because no ATP would be made since less protons pass through the ATP synthase. So option B is wrong. We're not told anything about the involvement of lysosome function, so this would be out of scope. Option C is wrong. As we mentioned, cyclophilin D's main function is to disrupt the mitochondrial membrane. The TRAP1 and cyclophilin D complex prevents the membrane from being damaged. It has nothing to do with the synthesis of ATP. Option C would be right if cyclophilin D reduced the amount of ATP made, but it doesn't. It just damages the cell membrane. Question 3, the information in the passage best supports which conclusion about the action of p53 and TRAP1? Again, pause if you need to. So the correct answer is B. As we can see in both figures, the p-value is less than 0.001, which indicates a significant relationship. Generally, the p-value should be less than 0.05 for something to be significant. It also makes sense that p53 is a tumor suppressor gene, so a high expression of mutated p53 would be expected to cause malignant tumors. Option A is wrong. We don't have enough information to conclude that p53 is part of the same pathway as TRAP1. All we know is that it's a tumor suppressor gene from basic knowledge. And option C is wrong. There is a statistical difference a statistical significance as we discussed. And option D is wrong. Age is not a significant factor because the p-value is greater than 0.05. Question 4, when studying the role of DNA regulation in response to the presence of p53, which of the below is not a suitable area of study to examine the activity of p53 in ovarian cancer cells? Again, pause if you need to. The correct answer is D. At first, I got stuck on this question because I thought of the Warburg effect and how cancerous cells use glycolysis more often so that they can divide more quickly. Actually, this is an error. The correct answer is A, not D. So I'll fix that in the slides. But the correct answer is A. So the Warburg effect is a fairly common thing to observe in all or most cancerous cells. So it wouldn't really tell us the action or activity of p53. To be more specific, we would study cell signaling, protein phosphorylation, or DNA methylation. Studying cell signaling would tell us where in the pathway p53 takes place. Protein phosphorylation, which leads to activation or deactivation, can tell us how genes are regulated. And since we know that p53 is a tumor suppressor, it would be helpful to know its phosphorylation patterns and how it affects cell activity. DNA methylation would also be helpful to study because, as we know, DNA methylation causes the silencing of genes and thus determines which genes are expressed and which are not. Question 5, again, pause if you need to. So this question is pretty straightforward. One thing that you absolutely need to have memorized is the structure of all of the nucleotides. If we remove this amine group on cytosine, we're left with uracil. So A is our answer. And I'll pass it on to Sin to do the other passage.
You can see it, right? So this is a Cars passage talking about Chinese colonialism. So I'm going to take you through it as though I were reading it, like how I normally take it. So China remained comparatively untouched by European civilization until less than a century ago, but between 1839 and 1860, the British bombarded Chinese ports and massacred the Chinese people to ensure the continuance of the opium trade. Besides the profit from this lucrative trade, they extorted millions of pounds as indemnities, seized Hong Kong and the territory on the mainland, and opened Chinese ports to British trade by force. This resulted in the steady drain of silver from China for the purpose of opium and the ruin of Chinese handicraft industry. The Manchu government broke down under the blows of the British Navy, and the Chinese official class were corrupted by opium smuggling. In short, the British Empire ruined the foundation of the once great civilization of China. So I would try to do a quick summary of the paragraph. So it's just talking about how China was exploited by European civilization, and this particular paragraph is talking about the British. So going on to the next paragraph, by 1870, there were other European rivals to Britain in this plundering of China. Russia and France stole large territories. The British seized Burma. China was still a market, and between 1851 and 1855, the excess of imports over exports from China was over 175 million pounds or euros. The Chinese people had to now give concessions and accept loans in order to buy iron and steel from Europe. They had no choice in the matter. The British government on occasion offered them the choice of taking British loans to buy British products or facing British guns. But while all of Europe joined in on this exploitation of China, the British did the most damage. So this paragraph introduces how there were also other European powers controlling China, and it's also talking about a trade like inequality where the Chinese people have to depend on European goods or face like a threat of war or like facing British guns. But then it still reasserts at the end how Britain did the most damage. So going on to the next paragraph, in 1894, the scramble entered its most dangerous but inevitable phase. Japanese capitalists tried to annex a portion of China, but the annexation clashed with British and other European interests. Russia and France intervened and checked her in defense of their own interests. Japan was too weak to assert her rights. It's a different story today. Yet she got a treaty port and 34.5 million in indemnity. To pay this, British and other European banks lent China 48 million. This organized banditry threw an ever-increasing load on the millions of peasants out of whose produce came the taxes to pay these loans. The situation is unsustainable and will no doubt lead to revolution. So it's talking about how Japan tried to annex China, but then the European powers prevented that because of their own interests, but still they paid Japan a sum, and that sum came from taxes from the Chinese peasantry. So that sort of injustice is setting up the grounds for a revolution, and the author sees that as inevitable, and he has no doubt that it will come. So that's picking up on an author's perspective. So the next paragraph, the inevitability of revolution has been seen by others as well. As far as back as 1856, Karl Marx has seen that the devastating influences of this unceasing plunder of China would end in revolution. In its essential outlines, the analysis is today as sound as when it was made, but the rottenness of the Manchu dynasty was propped up by the military and financial support given it by the European governments, and the Chinese middle class, mainly commercial, could not provide the sources for the liberation of China. As in Russia, it was the entry of capital and the consequent creation of a native industrial working class and organized and disciplined by large-scale production that was to provide means for the destruction of foreign capitalist domination in China. So it's talking about a revolution that was set up that was only possible once the working class had an organized production scale that was possible by the entry of capital. So we don't get much detail on the entry of capital, but this is the author's opinion that this was a turning point for how the revolution was possible. So it's with this entry of capital. And the last paragraph is going to continue on this point and say, it was this process which Lenin saw so clearly in 1908. In Asia, the peasants will aid the revolution. He based his claim on his calculations for world revolution described in his book, Imperialism. Small though the Chinese or Indian working class might be, as in Russia, it would have as allies the hundreds of millions of peasants, sucked dry before by Oriental feudalism, but now driven to ruin by the burden which capitalist exploitation placed upon them. The exploitation that the colonial powers, and especially Britain, brought on Chinese peasants would lead them to revolt. So this is talking about why it's so inevitable, and that's because if these peasants are being so exploited, they will eventually have to rise up against it to either correct it or at least try to revolt. Okay, moving on to the question, why does the author assert that the British Empire seriously damaged Chinese society? So the first one is not explicitly stated. Actually, if we look back in here, they said that the Manchu dynasty was actually rotten, so that also makes that incorrect. And for two, it's never mentioned that the British encourage other European countries to invade China. It's just mentioned that they are also involved in the exploitation of China. Whereas three is explicitly mentioned, so that the answer is C. So here is the part where it says the British bombarded Chinese ports, so that's using their navy to attack their ports, and then this is the part that says there were other European rivals, but it doesn't say that the British encouraged them. Next question, which of the following consequences would have been most likely if no other European country but the British had a presence in China? So the whole second and first paragraph were implying how the British had a really disproportionate influence on China, like they were the biggest exploiter. So even without the other countries, the Chinese would have been exploited. So D is the correct answer. So Chinese civilization would not have been preserved if it was just the British, because they did a ton of damage. And it actually, with A, it's actually said that the European powers protected China, like for their own interests. So without them, China would have been, a part of China would have been annexed to the Japanese. So that's the opposite of A. And then C is not mentioned. It's implied that the British were strong enough to overpower the Chinese on their own. So D is the correct answer. And that's the most direct evidence for it. Okay, number 3, which of the following assertions, if true, would most support the author's revolution, but the situation in China will no doubt lead to revolution? So this is talking about the reason for revolution. And as we discussed while we were going through the passage, that was because the peasants were being exploited. So you're looking for an answer choice that that makes living difficult for Chinese citizens. So if many staple products come from Europe, it doesn't really give enough detail if this is like a hardship for the Chinese citizens. If European trade tactics cause the food price to rise dramatically, that is something that would serve as exploitation, because it would make daily life hard for them, and that can be a reason for revolution. If China's Asian neighbors also suffered under Chinese rule, that does not explain why China's peasants would rise up in revolution. And then lastly, if Chinese citizens in European-controlled areas are not allowed to own firearms, that doesn't have anything to do with being exploited. It might be talking about control, but that's not the same idea. So B is talking about how revolution is a means of destruction of foreign capitalist domination, and how the peasants are rising up because they're driven to ruin by capitalist exploitation, of which rise in prices could be one example. And then the fourth question, given the information presented in the second paragraph, which of the following would most reasonably be inferred? So show the second paragraph. So it doesn't mention Russia and France not attacking Chinese ports, but we don't have enough information to not assume it. Like, we know the paragraph doesn't say it didn't happen. It just said that in the previous paragraph that the British did this. And for steel and iron prices, it says that the Chinese people had to buy them because they were essentially forced to, but doesn't talk about if prices were high or low. In fact, if they were forced to buy it, you might lean towards them prices being high so that it benefits the European powers. So for C, it's talking about China once controlled Burma, and that might seem like a random answer, but you have to pick up on this phrase where it says the British seized Burma. So because Burma is another country, that might seem like random in this paragraph, in this passage talking about China, but if China seized Burma and Burma is a territory of China, then it makes sense that the British annexing their territory would be a exploitation of China in that sense. So that's what you have to pick up on. And then nothing suggests that China doesn't have a navy of their own. It just says that in the first paragraph that the British attacked their ports as well. So that's how you go about this one. The fifth one, the point that the author makes about the possibility of a Chinese peasant revolt is most analogous to. So this is talking about how they're burdened and driven to ruin so that they are forced to stand up. So it's talking about something bad happening to someone so that they have to speak up or act out against it. So that is most relevant to A, where the child who is exploited, I guess, in a way, if they're forced to do too many chores, they're likely to act out against what they feel is injustice. Whereas B, if you're given something positive and you're likely to stay, that does not have to do anything with what's talking about the passage, which is just talking about exploitation leading to a stand against like whoever's in power. And then the political science principle that single countries can rarely resist coordinated international action is not what it's talking about. The part, so this is relevant to the part where China is unable to like resist the European powers, but it doesn't have to do with the part where the Chinese peasants are revolting. So you also have to make sure, like, even if this might be applicable to another part of the passage, it doesn't answer the question, like this particular question, which is talking about the peasant revolt part of the passage. And lastly, D, the claim that wars that take place outside of one's country are unlikely to concern one's citizens. It's irrelevant to this passage at all. So the passage doesn't mention like wars taking outside of China and how they're not affecting China's peasants. So in this, A is correct because the Chinese peasants would be like the child who is forced to do too many chores, so like forced to endure too many burdens. And so that exploitation is making them have to revolt. And the sixth question, assume that a scholar is planning an extensive study of the modern history of China. The author of the passage would probably say that the most important task to be performed is. So this is a main idea question. So examining how Chinese international relations affected the Chinese people. So this might be relevant to the first part of the passage where it's talking about, well, but that's not even really international relations. But even if you think about like the other powers overpowering, the European countries overpowering China, that doesn't address the revolt part of it. So I would hold off on that, but it doesn't seem quite true. So B, comparing the behavior of various European colonists in China. So no, that's not the main idea, because the main idea is how the Chinese peasantry reacted to this exploitation. And then C is definitely not true, because the Manchu dynasty is definitely just mentioned in passing as like what came before the European exploitation. Studying the impact of international trade on China's economy. So that's also not what we're most concerned with. So we're talking about how the peasantry are influenced. So even though I was unsure about A at the beginning, now I can see like it was the best option. So it is, I guess it is talking about how Chinese international relations is how they're affected by other countries affecting the Chinese people. So though it doesn't mention like the revolt, it's kind of implying like a first step of that. So that if the Chinese people are exploited because of the other powers' relations with China, then that is the best choice out of the other choices. And the last question, how would the author best clarify the statement that though many European countries invaded China, the British did the most damage? So it's just asking for evidence for this claim. So by comparing damage done to Chinese ports with those done to Chinese cities, so this doesn't look at British versus other countries, comparing fortunes of Hong Kong to cities taken by other European countries. So like maybe, I think it's mentioned that Hong Kong was taken over by British power, while the other cities, so I would hold off on that. Maybe this is the right answer. By comparing the size of the British military presence in China to that of other European countries. This one was tempting, but the way that the answer was explained, and you have to think about that, is that even if the British had a huge military presence, like if they didn't do any damage, like that doesn't mean that the biggest military presence had to do the biggest damage. And the last question, the last option, by comparing how much of the European trade imbalance with China was with Britain versus other countries. Okay, so this is talking about how, because of the trade imbalance, that was the thing that affected the peasantry the most. Like they had to pay taxes that came out of their livelihoods. So this is probably the better answer than B, because the point of the paragraph is how these countries and their actions affected the Chinese peasantry and working class. So we're relating the trade imbalance to like the cause of the revolution and the things that affected the Chinese working peasantry. So this is why that's the better answer than B. And that was the last question for me. Back to so it's talking about the same like exploitation reason as the cause for revolution. So yeah, back to Ashley for the psych-soc passage.
Okay, so for the psych-soc passage, we'll be doing stereotypes and mathematical ability from Jack Weston. So you can pause the video to read this for yourself. I'll also read it out loud. So let's begin. It is hypothesized that in self-categorization theory, individuals who subjectively identify with their group are more likely to cognitively activate their group identity in the presence of identity-relevant cues. This perspective suggests that stereotype boost and stereotype threat effects should be more pronounced among individuals who strongly identify with their stereotyped group. A study involving Asian American and Latino undergraduate students took part in 2 sessions. In session 1, students completed a measure of ethnic identification and math identification. In the second session, which took place 1 to 2 weeks later, participants completed a difficult math exam with 14 questions. Before taking this exam, participants were randomly assigned to one of 2 ethnicity ethnic stereotype cue conditions: an experimental condition in which an ethnicity ethnic stereotype cue was present and a control condition in which this cue was not present. The cue in the experimental group was presented at the start of the math test as an introduction that stated mathematical ability is a true measure of intelligence and can show differences based on ethnic heritage. This introduction was aimed to prime the response of participants by stimulating racial identity stereotypes. The racial composition of the testing sessions was not controlled or recorded. The results of the exam are displayed in figures 1 and 2. Right, let's begin with the first question. Question 1, according to the passage, which definition below best describes stereotype boost? Right, pause the screen if you need to. So the correct answer is B. Based on the passage, we need to assume that stereotype boost and stereotype threat are opposite of each other. Stereotype threat decreases the performance of an individual. Stereotype boost should, on the other hand, improve performance. So choice A is wrong. Stereotypes do not impact behavior, but rather performance. Choice D is wrong. This describes the self-fulfilling prophecy, which states an individual's expectations will result in an individual behaving in a way that confirms this expectation. Question 2, Asian Americans in the ethnic identification study highlighted a number of factors that confirm common stereotypes. Which factor would least reinforce the stereotype that Asian Americans are good at mathematics? Correct answer is D. The question stem is specifically referring to Asian Americans, but option D is talking about Latinx students, so D would be our answer. Option A is wrong. If Asian Americans choose mathematical courses, this would reinforce the stereotype. Similarly, if Asian Americans chose math-oriented careers like engineering or accounting, this would also reinforce the stereotype. And finally, good grades in math courses would reinforce the stereotype as well. Question 3, in the design of the study, which approach has been utilized to design the stereotypical cue at the beginning of the test? Correct answer is C. Top-down processing starts with the most general or broad idea and then moves towards more specific ideas. In this scenario, the most general idea would be the stereotype, that mathematical ability is based on ethnicity, which influences their understanding of the test that they took. So we use top-down processing very often. For example, if you're trying to understand something, you'll often look for answers in previous memories to help your understanding. Option A is wrong. Gestalt principles refers to the perception of visual elements. Option B is wrong. Bottom-up processing uses smaller, more specific ideas to influence one's broad perspective. So it's the opposite of top-down. Finally, option D is wrong. Functional fixedness is defined as the tendency to view a problem or a situation in only one certain way. For example, if you're trying to solve a Rubik's Cube, functional fixedness will try to make you solve the Rubik's Cube the same way you have before rather than finding a different method. Question 4, which explanation of the results of the study presents the most appropriate application of Yerkes-Dodson theory? The correct answer is A. The Yerkes-Dodson theory tells us that performance increases with arousal up to a point. When the person is too aroused, the performance will drop. In figure 2, we're shown that Asian Americans perform better when they're given the stereotype cue. So this fits with the Yerkes-Dodson theory because these students are aroused by the stereotype, so they'll perform better. Option B is wrong. In students with a high ethnic identification, the stereotype cue lowers their performance for Latino students. Option C is wrong. We can see in figure 2, students with a low ethnic identification perform worse without a cue than students with a cue. Option D is wrong. In figure 1, we can see that the performance of males and females increased when presented with a cue and without a cue. So stereotyping increased performance. Question 5, which measure would be most useful if the researchers were interested in the degree of stress induced by the exam? Correct answer is B. A common symptom of stress would be sweating. So measuring the electrical conductivity of the skin would be a good way to measure this. Option A is wrong. Melatonin is a chemical responsible for regulating the sleep cycle, so it wouldn't be a stress hormone like cortisol. Option C is wrong. The hindbrain has a role in survival behavior like sleep and motor activity. And a CT scan of the hindbrain wouldn't tell us anything about stress. The parietal lobe is also responsible for perception and sensation, so it wouldn't be associated with stress. And those were all the questions for today. Thank you for watching this recording. And if you have any questions, you can always email us. I stopped the recording.
Okay.